"Sign it," said the Duke of Inglethorpe, and hated the sound of his own voice, "and there is an end of it." The pen lay across the paper between them like a fallen sword, and Lucian St. Aubyn, 9th Duke of Inglethorpe, watched his wife of 11 months look at it, as though it were a living thing that might bite her. The morning light came through the tall library windows of Inglethorpe Court in long grey bars, catching the dust and the gilt of the shelves, catching the pale line of her throat, catching everything but her eyes, which she kept lowered. She had worn the plainest of her gowns, the grey one, the one she had arrived in a year ago as a bride nobody in the county had thought good enough. He had thought her good enough. He had thought a great many foolish things. "You have read it," he said, because the silence was unbearable, and he had never in his life been able to bear a silence that belonged to her. "My man of business drew it up. It says only what is true, that the marriage was contracted under a false understanding, that it is dissolved, that you go without stain and without want. There is a settlement. You will never lack for anything." Still she did not speak. Cordelia. Her name was Cordelia, and 11 months ago he had said it in this very room like a man tasting sugar for the first time, and now it sat in his chest like a stone he could not swallow. She reached out one hand, bare, he noted. She had left off her rings. She had laid them on the table by the door as she came in, as though she had already known, and she took up the pen. She turned it once in her fingers. Then she bent over the paper, and in a small firm hand that did not tremble at all, she wrote her name, Cordelia St. Aubyn, and then, after a breath, below it, as though correcting herself, the name she had come to him with, Cordelia Wren. That double signature undid him more than tears would have. It was the act of a woman putting down one life and picking up another with her own hands, calmly, without protest, without so much as a curse for the man who had made her do it. "Cordelia," he said. She rose. She did not look at him even then. She smoothed the grey stuff of her skirt with both palms, the way a servant smooths an apron, and she inclined her head, not a bow of anger, not a bow of grief, but the small correct curtsy a well-bred woman gives a stranger of rank, and she walked to the door. Her boots made almost no sound on the great carpet. At the threshold she paused, and for one wild moment he thought she would turn, would speak, would fling the whole rotten business back in his teeth and demand he explain himself, and God help him, he did not know what he would have answered. But she only reached up and touched the door frame once with 2 fingers, lightly, the way one touches something one is leaving forever and wishes to remember. And then she was gone, and the door clicked shut behind her, and the Duke of Inglethorpe stood alone in his library with a signed paper and the ruin of his own life laid neatly before him on the desk. He should have been relieved. That was the terrible thing. His cousin had assured him he would be relieved. His cousin had spent 3 weeks assuring him of a great many things, each one dropped like a slow poison into a cup, and he had drunk them all down because he had been afraid, and because he was proud, and because the evidence had seemed, at the time in that fevered season, to be past all argument. Now in the plain grey light, with the woman herself walking away down his gravel drive to a hired carriage, he felt no relief at all. He felt as though he had cut off his own right hand to spite a wasp that had never stung him. He crossed to the window. He should not have. But he crossed to the window, and he stood behind the curtain like a coward, and he watched her. She walked down the long avenue of limes without hurry. She carried a single small trunk, though he had ordered that all her things be sent after her. She had refused everything but this one trunk, which she carried herself, refusing the footman's arm. She was not weeping. He could see, even at this distance, that her back was very straight and her chin was level. And once, near the gate, she stopped and turned and looked back, not at the house, not his window, but at the great cedar that stood on the south lawn, the one they had sat beneath in the first weeks of the marriage, while she read aloud to him, and he pretended to listen to the book and listened instead to her voice. She looked at the cedar for a long moment. Then she turned again and walked out through the gates of Inglethorpe Court. And a man he did not know handed her up into a plain carriage, and the carriage rolled away toward the London road, and Lucian St. Aubyn understood, with the cold total certainty of a man watching a ship go down with everything he owned aboard it, that he had made the single greatest mistake of his life, and that he had made it with his own hand. He did not know yet how great. He did not know yet what she carried away with her under the grey stuff of that plain travelling gown, held close and silent and secret against her own heart. He did not know, and she did not tell him, and she would not tell him, and it would be years, long, grinding, hollow years, before the truth came crawling up out of the dark where his cousin had buried it, and turned his careful, honorable, ruined life inside out. But that morning he knew only this, that she had signed without a word, and walked away without a word, and that the silence of her going would ring in his ears until he died. He turned from the window at last and looked at the desk. The paper lay there. Beneath the two signatures, in his cousin's neat clerkly hand, were the false clauses, the careful lies dressed in the sober black of the law. And Lucien, standing very still, felt the first cold finger of doubt move along his spine, not enough, not nigh enough to stop what had already been done, but enough to make him wonder for the first time in 3 weeks whether he had been made a fool of. He rang the bell. When the butler came, old Penniton, who had known him since he was a boy in leading strings, who had said nothing this whole black season, but had watched him with old sorrowful eyes, the Duke said, "Has Mrs. Wren gone? The carriage is away, your grace. Where does it take her?" "I could not say, your grace. She left no direction." A pause. She left this, and Penniton held out on the silver tray a small folded square of paper, and the Duke's heart leapt like a stag before the hounds, for he thought, fool, that it was a letter, an accusation, a plea, some last word from her that might yet unlock the whole business. He snatched it up and unfolded it. It was not a letter. It was the key to the still room and the linen presses, which as mistress of the house she had carried on a ribbon at her waist, and which she had returned wrapped in a leaf torn from her prayer book. And on the leaf she had written nothing at all except, in that same small firm hand, "I thank you for your kindness to the servants." See, nothing for himself, not one word for himself. Only a housekeeper's courtesy and a woman's dignity, and the key cold in his palm, and the whole of Inglethorpe Court silent around him as a tomb. That was on a Tuesday in the March of the year the whole affair began to be spoken of in the county. And for a long time afterward the county spoke of nothing else. How the young Duke of Inglethorpe had wed a nobody, a clergyman's penniless daughter with a pretty face and no connections, and how after less than a year he had put her quietly aside, and how she had gone without fuss or scandal, which somehow made it worse, for scandal at least a person may enjoy, but a quiet grief gives nothing to feed on. The county decided, on the whole, that she must have deserved it. The county is always ready to decide that a woman deserved it. Only old Penniton and the cedar, and the Duke himself in the small hours when he could not sleep, knew otherwise. And of the three, only the Duke could speak, and he did not, for a long time, know what to say. To understand how it came to that grey Tuesday, one must go back. One must go back to the summer before, to the crowded, glittering, brittle season when Lucien St-Aubin, newly come into his dukedom at the death of his father, was the most hunted man in 3 counties and wanted none of it. He had been 33 that summer, tall and dark and reputed cold, with a jaw like the prow of a ship and a way of looking at a person that made them feel weighed and found wanting. It was not coldness, though the world called it so. It was grief, badly worn. His father had died hard, in pain, over many months, and Lucien had sat by him and watched a great strong man be reduced to a whisper, and had left a mark on him that the ballrooms took for arrogance. He did not care to dance. He did not care to be flattered. He came into a room and stood at the edge of it with his glass untouched and his face shut like a door, and the matrons steered their daughters toward him like small painted ships toward a rock, and he wrecked them all, one after another, with 3 cold civil words and a bow, and went home alone to the great empty house and the cousin who managed his affairs. The cousin. That was where the poison began, though Lucien did not know it then and would curse himself later for not seeing it. His cousin was named Aurelius Vane, a distant connection on the mother's side, some years the Duke's elder, a smooth, clever man with soft hands and a soft voice and an eye that missed nothing and forgave nothing. Vane had made himself indispensable. He had come to Inglethorpe as a young man, poor and clever and hungry, and the old Duke had given him a place, and Aurelius had made that place into a kingdom of his own. He kept the books. He knew the rents, the mortgages, the tangled affairs of the estate down to the last farthing. He knew, too, what Lucien did not trouble to know, which of the tenant families were behind, which of the London tradesmen were pressing, exactly how much the great proud, glittering edifice of the Dukedom of Inglethorpe was, in truth, mortgaged to the eyes and quietly sinking. Vane knew, because Vane had arranged a good deal of it, quietly over years in ways that put money into his own careful hands. And Vane had one great fear, one single terror that governed all his soft smiling calculation, that someday the Duke would marry, and marry a woman with wit enough to look at the books, and Heiress Vane could manage. And Heiress would come with lawyers and settlements and her own men of business, and it could all be arranged, sweetened, hidden. But a poor wife, a clever poor wife, a wife with nothing to do all day but grow curious about her husband's affairs, a wife who read and asked questions and remembered answers, that was the one thing Aurelius Vane could not have. And that, to his soft horror, was exactly the wife the Duke of Inglethorpe chose. He had met her in the least like place in England for a duke to meet his wife, in the rain on a country lane, with a broken carriage wheel and a dead lantern, 3 miles from anywhere. It had been the tag end of that first empty summer. Lucian had grown so weary of London and its mothers that he had fled north to look at a piece of property he was thinking of buying, and had dismissed his outriders, and had driven himself in a light gig through a country he did not know, and had contrived, being a proud man who would not stop to ask directions, to lose himself entirely in a warren of Somerset lanes as the light failed and the rain came down in ropes. The gig had lurched into a rut, the wheel had cracked, and the Duke of Inglethorpe had found himself standing in the mud in the dark, soaked to the bone, holding a lame horse and swearing softly at the universe, when a light came bobbing up the lane toward him. It was a young woman with a shawl over her head and a lantern in her hand, come out from a low grey vicarage that he had not even seen behind its dripping hedge. She was not beautiful in the way the season measured beauty. She was too pale, too slight, her hair coming down out of its pins in the wet, but she looked at the wreck of his gig and at the state of him. Instead of exclaiming or fluttering, she said briskly, "You'll not mend that tonight. Bring the horse. There's a stable and my father will give you supper, and in the morning the wheelwright's boy can be fetched." And then, seeing him hesitate, for he was a duke and dukes do not take supper in strange vicarages, and he was on the point of saying so, she added, with the smallest dry curl at the corner of her mouth, "Or you may stand here in the rain on your dignity, sir, if you prefer it. It is all one to me." But the horse would rather be dry. No one had spoken to him like that in years. No one had dared. He went with her. The vicarage was poor. Genteel poor, the poverty of a good family with too little money and too much learning. And her father was a mild, scholarly clergyman, half-blind, wholly kind, who talked of Greek verbs and the migration of swallows and never once asked his guest's name or business, taking him simply as a wet traveller sent by Providence to be fed. And the daughter, Cordelia, he learned Cordelia Wren, her mother long dead, keeping her father's house and half his parish on nothing at all. The daughter moved about that shabby room lighting candles and setting out a supper of bread and cold mutton and their own honey, and talked. When she talked of books of the world, of things he had not heard a woman speak of since his own mother died, she had read everything. She had read things he had not. She argued with him gently and without deference, over a point of history. When he proved her wrong she conceded it at once and laughed at herself, and when she proved him wrong, which she did twice, before the fire burned low, she did not gloat but only looked pleased, the honest pleasure of a mind that loved being right for the truth's sake and not for the triumph. He did not tell them who he was. He told them his name was St. Aubin, which was true, and let them think him a gentleman of small estate, which they did. And he slept that night in a narrow cold guest bed under a darned counterpane and lay awake a long time listening to the rain and to something he had not felt in years, which was the wish for the morning to come so that he might see a particular face again. He stayed 3 days. The wheelwright's boy was strangely slow, and the Duke of Inglethorpe, who could have sent to the nearest town and had 6 wheels and a new carriage brought before noon, said nothing to hurry him. He walked the parish with Cordelia. He carried her basket to the sick and the old, and watched her sit by dying men and read to them, and watched the poor of that parish look at her, as though she were the only warm thing in a cold county, and he understood that he was in the presence of something he had begun to think did not exist, a person who was good all the way through, good in the marrow, Good when no one was watching, and there was nothing to be gained by it. On the third evening he told her the truth. He told her by the stile at the edge of the glebe field, with the sun going down red behind the elms, because he could not bear to deceive her another hour, and because he had already resolved, in the reckless hidden depths of himself, what he meant to do. "I have not been honest with you," he said. "My name is St. Aubyn, that is true, but I am the Duke of Inglethorpe." She went very still. Then, to his everlasting astonishment, she laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of rueful dismay, and said, "Oh, that is a great pity? A pity?" "I had thought," she said, and colour came up into her pale face, and she looked away across the field, "that is, I had come to think of you as a friend, and now you are a duke, and dukes are not friends with vicarage girls. And you will drive away in the morning in whatever grand thing your servants bring, and I shall have made a fool of myself, and I would rather you had let me go on thinking you were only Mr. St. Aubyn, who did not mind carrying a basket." She lifted her chin. "But there, it is done. I hope you had a pleasant rest, your grace, and I wish you a safe journey." "Cordelia," he said, the first time he had used her name, "I do not want to be your friend." The colour drained and then flooded back. "Then I have mistaken you entirely, and I am sorry for it, and I will bid you good." "I want," said the Duke of Inglethorpe, who had faced down a dozen matchmaking mothers and 100 simpering heiresses without a flicker, and who now found his heart going like a hammer and his mouth gone dry as August, "I want to marry you. I have wanted it, I think, since you told me I might stand in the rain on my dignity. I have been 33 years alone in a great house, and I did not know it was possible to be otherwise until I sat at your father's table. I have money and a name and a great many things I do not value, and I would give the half of them to hear you read aloud to me every evening of my life, 'Marry me,' because I am a duke, in spite of it, if you like. Only marry me." She did not answer at once. That was one of the 1,000 things he came to love in her. She never answered at once, never gushed, never seized. She looked at him a long moment in the red light, and her eyes, grey-level, honest, searched his face as though reading a difficult page, and then she said quietly, "You understand what you are saying. Your world will not have me. Your friends will laugh. Your relations will call me an adventuress and worse. I have no fortune, no connection, no beauty they will grant me. You will pay a price for this, and go on paying it, and I will not have you wake one morning and count the cost and hate me for it." "I will never hate you," he said, and believed it with his whole soul, and was wrong and did not know that he was wrong, and the not knowing was the seed of everything that followed. "Then yes," said Cordelia Wren, "yes, Lucian, I will marry you, and I will read to you every evening of your life. And I will love you, which you did not ask for, but shall have anyway." And she put her hand in his over the stile, roughened with work, warm, entirely without artifice, and the Duke of Inglethorpe kissed it once, gravely, like a vow. And then they walked back to the vicarage together in the last of the light to tell her father, who wept and blessed them, and asked whether a duke required any particular sort of Greek at the wedding. They were married quietly in that same small church 3 months later, and the county came, how the county came, in its silks and its curiosity and its cold appraising eyes, and looked, and did not approve, and said so behind its fans. And the one man who did not come, who pleaded a fever and sent his cold regrets and his warm congratulations, was Aurelius Vane, sitting alone at Inglethorpe Court with the account books spread before him, doing sums of a private and terrible kind, and watching through the window the road down which the Duke would bring home a poor, clever, curious wife who read everything and forgot nothing. The first months were the happiest of Lucian's life, and he knew it even as he lived them, which is a rare and precious thing and given to few. Cordelia took to Inglethorpe not as a girl dazzled by grandeur, but as a woman come home to a great deal of work. She learned the house. She learned the servants' names and their troubles, and remembered them. She went among the tenants as she had gone among her father's parish, with a basket and a level eye, and where she found a leaking roof or a hungry family she came home and told the Duke of it plainly, and the Duke, who had left all such things to Vane for years, Trincurious, began, for the first time, to attend to his own estate. And that was the beginning of the end, though it wore the face of a beginning. For Cordelia, in the natural way of a mistress learning her house, began to ask questions, small ones at first. Why was the North Farm let go so cheap? Why had the mill not been repaired, when the miller had asked 3 years running? Where did the rents go that the roofs were not mended? She did not ask them of the Duke, at first, not wishing to seem to meddle in what she did not understand. She asked them of the tenants themselves, and of old Penniton, and once, fatally, of Aurelius Vane, cornering him in the estate office one wet afternoon with a ledger open and a clear grey question in her eyes. "Mr. Vane," she said pleasantly, "I cannot make these figures agree with what the tenants tell me. Perhaps you would explain them to me. I am sure it is only that I do not understand bookkeeping." And Aurelius Vane looked at the young Duchess of Inglethorpe across his own carefully cooked ledger, and smiled his soft smile, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just heard the first crack of the ice beneath his feet, that she understood bookkeeping very well indeed, and that unless he acted, and acted soon, and acted without mercy, she would in time understand everything, and he would hang. "Of course, Your Grace," said Aurelius Vane, and bowed, and closed the ledger, and began that very night to plan the destruction of the only good thing that had ever happened to the master he served. Those first married months at Inglethorpe the Duke kept, ever after, in a locked chamber of his memory, and went back to them in his darkest hours the way a man cold in winter goes back in his mind to a summer he once knew, and they never lost their warmth for him, though the knowledge of how he had thrown them away turned the warmth, in time, to a kind of sweet, unbearable ache. She had changed the house without ever seeming to change it. She did not order it about. She did not turn out old servants or hang new curtains or any of the things a new duchess might do to mark her territory. She simply moved through the great cold rooms and, wherever she went, a little warmth was left behind her, like a fire carried from hearth to hearth. She learned the housemaids' names in a week and their sorrows in a fortnight. She found out that the second footman's mother was ill and quietly arranged that he should have leave to see her. She discovered old Penniton's rheumatism, without a word to anyone, had a cushion put on the hard chair he was too proud to complain of. She did these things not to be loved, though she was loved for them, but because it was simply her nature, as it is the nature of water to run downhill, to notice where kindness was wanted and to supply it. The Duke, watching half in wonder, learned more about the running of a great household in 3 months of marriage than he had learned in 33 years of owning one, and learned it all from her, and did not begrudge a moment of the schooling. In the evenings she read to him. That was the heart of it, the thing he mourned longest. After dinner they would go to the small warm sitting room, not the great library, which she said was too grand for comfort, but a little room with a good fire where she kept her sewing and her books. And she would take up whatever they were reading, poetry or history or some traveller's tale of far places, and read aloud in her clear low voice while he sat with his eyes half closed, and let the words wash over him like a tide. Sometimes he did not follow the sense of it at all. He only listened to her voice, and watched the firelight on her face, and thought that he had lived 33 years without knowing what a home was, and that this was it, this small warm room and this quiet voice, and that he would trade the whole rest of Inglethorpe and every acre and title he owned to keep it. He never told her so. That was one of his failures, small among the great ones, but he counted it, that in all those happy months he never once found the plain words to tell her what she was to him. Being a proud, reserved man, unpractised in the language of the heart, and so she had to guess at his love from his silences, and a woman ought not to have to guess. And under it all, unseen, Aurelius Vane went about his patient work. The Duke, looking back, could count the exact steps of his own destruction, though he had been blind to every one of them as it fell. He remembered the first time Vane had spoken of the Duchess with that little hesitation, that small held-back sorrow, and how it had troubled him, and how he had thought no more of it, and how the trouble had lodged all the same like a splinter, working inward. He remembered Vane's soft solicitude, how his cousin, in those weeks, was forever at his elbow, forever helpful, forever there, so that the Duke came to lean on him more and more even as the poison went deeper, never dreaming that the hand that steadied him was the hand that had loosened the ground beneath his feet. He remembered with a shudder how skillfully Vane had played upon his oldest wound, The wound of the unloved son who had watched his father die and thought no one would ever love him so. How Vane had never once said a word against the Duchess directly, but had only gently, sorrowfully, made room in the Duke's own heart for the Duke to condemn her. How the whole murder of their marriage had been done, in the end, not by Vane's hand at all, but by the Duke's. Vane merely holding the lamp, while the Duke groped his own way to the ruin. That was the devil's true cunning. He never made the Duke believe a lie so much as he made the Duke want to. He found the fear that was already there, and he fed it until it grew big enough to swallow the truth whole. There was one evening the Duke remembered above all the others, and it was the last good evening, though he had not known it, 3 days before the letters. Cordelia had been quieter than her wont, and he had asked her what troubled her, and she had put down her book and looked at him a long moment with her clear grey eyes, and said, "Lucien, may I ask you something, and will you promise not to be angry?" And he had promised, and she had said, "Carefully, I have been going about the estate, as you know, and among the tenants, and I have begun to think that your affairs are not, that all is not as it should be. The rents that come in do not seem to match the state of the farms. The roofs go unmended, and the money goes somewhere. I do not understand bookkeeping well, and I may be quite wrong, and I would not for the world seem to accuse anyone. But I love you, and I love this place, and I think you should look into your own books yourself, and not leave everything to Mr. Vane, will you? For me?" And the Duke of Inglethorpe, this was the memory that scalded him worst of all, had smiled at her and taken her hand and said, fondly, indulgently, "You have been listening to grumbling tenants, my love. There are always grumbling tenants. Vane has kept these books 30 years, and my father trusted him with everything. Do not trouble your head with figures. It is not a fit worry for you." And he had kissed her and turned the subject, and never looked at the books, and 3 days later the letters were laid before him, and the marriage was dead. He had had the truth offered to him by the one person who loved him freely, plainly. In time to save everything, she had all but named the villain, had put her finger on the very crime, and he had smiled and patted her hand and told her not to trouble her head, if he had listened. If he had only once listened. He would go over that evening in the small hours for years, changing it in his mind, letting himself say instead, "Yes, I will look, come and show me," and the whole black avalanche undone, the letters never believed, the 6 years never lost, the son not born in secret by a Gracie. But a man cannot unlive an evening, and the Duke of Inglethorpe learned that too, learned it to the marrow, that the small closed doors of our pride are where the great tragedies get in. He told her of that memory, once, long after, when they were married again and safe, and old grief could be spoken of by a warm fire. He told her that he remembered the evening she had begged him to look at the books, and that he had not, and that he counted among the worst of his failures. And Cordelia, sewing by the fire, had been quiet a moment, and then had said gently, "I remember it too. I thought that night that I had married a man who would not hear me, and it frightened me more than the crooked figures did. For a wife may bear a poor estate, but she cannot bear a husband who smiles and pats her hand and will not listen. That was the first crack, Lucien, before ever the letters came. The letters only wadened it, and the Duke had bowed his head under the justice of it, and then had looked up and said, "I hear you now. I will hear you every day I have left. Try me. Tell me the hardest, truest, least welcome thing you know, and watch me listen." And she had smiled, and set another stitch, and said, "I shall hold you to that, your grace." And he had answered, "See that you do," and it was, in its quiet way, the truest vow that ever passed between them, truer than either wedding, the vow of a man who had learned, at ruinous cost. The whole hard worth of listening, made to the woman whose voice he had once been fool enough not to hear. Aurelius Vane did not strike at her with lies about the money. That would have been clumsy, and it would have put the very books she was curious about into the light, which was the last thing he wished. A clever poisoner does not poison the dish the physician is watching. He poisons the cup no one thinks to guard. And the cup Aurelius Vane chose to poison was the Duke's pride, and the thing he chose to poison it with was the oldest and cheapest venom there is, a lie about a woman's honor. He worked slowly. He was patient as a spider. He began with nothing but silences and glances, a hesitation before answering when the Duke mentioned his wife. A small sad look quickly smoothed away, the manner of a man who knows a grievous thing and is too loyal or too kind to speak it. Lucian, who trusted him utterly, noticed, and was troubled and asked, and Vane demurred, and would not say, and thereby made the Duke certain there was something to say. That is the whole art of it. You need not tell the lie. You need only make the man beg you for it, so that when at last you yield, he thinks he has dragged the truth out of an unwilling friend. The lie, when Vane at last consented to be dragged into telling it, was this, that the Duchess had a lover, that before her marriage, in the parish where the Duke had found her so conveniently, there had been a man, a poor gentleman, a soldier, someone spoken of in whispers, and that the marriage to the Duke had been a scheme from the beginning, hatched by the girl and the mysterious soldier together, to get a fortune and a name, and that even now the fellow came and went, and that letters passed, and that the Duke's own honour, the succession of the ancient line of Inglethorpe, hung by a thread over a pit of deceit, was all false. Every word of it was false, spun out of nothing, hung upon the flimsiest of props. A real soldier who had indeed once lodged in the parish, a wholly innocent man Cordelia had scarcely spoken to, a bundle of letters that Vane forged with a patience and a skill that would have earned him a good living at an honest trade, in a hand made to look like a man's, full of tender words and veiled meetings, addressed to nobody and signed with an initial, and slipped by a bribed maid into the lining of the Duchess's own writing case, there to be discovered, oh, quite by accident, quite reluctantly, by the loyal, honourable Aurelius Vane, and Lucian, who loved her, believed it. That was the wound he could never afterward forgive himself. He believed it. Not all at once, not without a storm of denial, but Vane had built his lie too well, and had laid it too long, and had planted in the Duke's own breast, over those slow-poisoned weeks, the deadly readiness to believe. For here was the terrible thing at the root of Lucian St. Aubin. He had never in his heart thought himself worthy of her. He had married a woman good all the way through, and some part of him had always been waiting, in the dark, for the catch, for the price, for the revelation that so much undeserved happiness could not be real. Vane had found that waiting place and fed it. When the forged letters were laid before him in that hand so like a man's, full of endearments, Lucian did not think, "This is impossible, my wife is honesty itself." He thought, of course, I knew it was too much. I knew I could not be so loved. And the thought was so exactly the shape of his oldest secret fear that it wore the face of truth. He confronted her. God help him, he confronted her not with a question, which might have saved them both, but with the letters flung on the table and his face like a closed grave and his voice, when he could master it, gone cold and flat and terrible with the effort of not breaking. And Cordelia, this was the part he lived over and over in the years that followed. This was the part that woke him sweating in the dark. Cordelia looked at the letters and looked at his face and understood in one moment two things, that they were forgeries and that he believed them. And she saw in that one moment that a man who could believe such a thing of her on such evidence, upon the word of such a man, did not know her at all, had never known her, had loved a picture he had made and not the woman herself. And something in her, some proud clean living thing, folded its wings and died. She did not weep, she did not rage, she did not beg. She said only very quietly, "You believe this. I have the proof of it in my hand. You have paper in your hand. You have known me for near a year. You have known that paper for a minute, and you believed the paper." She rose. Her face was white but perfectly composed, and her voice did not shake, and that steadiness was more terrible to him than any weeping could have been. "I could tell you it is false. I could weep and swear and go on my knees, and perhaps I could make you doubt it for a day, and then some new whisper would come and you would believe again, and I would spend my life proving my innocence to a man who was ready to think me guilty. I will not lie so. I would rather be cast out honest than kept as a suspected thing. If your love was so poor as this, Lucian, then I was married to something I mistook, and it is better I know it now. Then you do not deny." "I deny all of it," she said, "and it will do no good, and we both know it will do no good, and that is the bitterest thing I have ever learned. Draw up your paper, your grace. Dissolve your marriage. I will sign it. I will not shame the name I bore for 11 months by fighting for a place at the side of a man who thinks so ill of me. Only, Here for the first and only time her voice caught one small catch quickly mastered. Only I had thought better of you. I had thought, of all the men in England, that you at least would ask me before you condemned me. That was my mistake, and I will not make it twice. And she went out of the room, and left him alone with the forged letters and his ruined faith. And 3 days later Aurelius Vane, all soft solemn sorrow, laid before the Duke a deed of annulment drawn up in proper form, with clauses and provisions and a generous settlement, and the Duke, sin-proud, and too far gone in the lie to draw back without admitting he had wrecked his life for nothing, signed his own part of it. And then came the grey Tuesday, and the pen like a fallen sword, and the 2 signatures in her small firm hand, and the door clicking shut, and the carriage on the London road. What no one knew, what Cordelia herself had known for scarcely a fortnight, and had told to not one living soul. Not her dying father, not the maid, not the Duke, above all not the Duke, was that she went out through the gates of Inglethorpe Court carrying, beneath the grey stuff of her gown, the beginning of his child. She had meant to tell him. That was the part she carried away that hurt the worst. On the very evening the forged letters were laid before him, she had come to the library meaning to tell him her glad secret, meaning to take his hand and say the words and watch his cold, grave, beloved face break open into joy. And instead she had found the letters flung upon the table and the accusation in his eyes, and she had understood in one stroke that the man she meant to make a father did not trust her to be faithful, and she had shut the secret up in her heart like a coal in the fist, and carried it out through the gates, and resolved with all the iron of her pride that he should never, never have it. For she reasoned thus, in the long jolting hours of that carriage, a man who believes me a wanton will believe the child no more his own than the letters were mine. He will look at his own son or daughter and see the phantom soldier's face. He will take the child for the name's sake and cast off the mother, and I will lose both, or he will believe me a liar twice over and cast off both, and either way there is nothing in it but grief. He did not want me. He shall not have what is mine. This child is mine, got in love whatever he now thinks, and I will raise it in honesty far from all of them, and it shall never know that its father put its mother out of doors on a forged letter, and it shall never learn to be ashamed. And she laid her hand over the small secret and shut her eyes and did not weep, because she had wept herself dry the night before, and there was nothing left, and the carriage carried her south into a life the Duke of Inglethorpe knew nothing of, and would know nothing of, for 6 long years. She did not go far, as it turned out, though he never found her. She had a mother's cousin, a plain, sensible widow named Mrs. Fenn, who kept a small girls' school in the seaside town of Malcomber, 2 counties off, and thither Cordelia went and was taken in, and became, under her maiden name, Mrs. Wren, now by common courtesy, a young widow the school supposed her, a teacher of the little ones, of reading and figures and the globes, and a great deal of kindness. She wrote to her father a careful letter that told him she and the Duke had found they did not suit, and that she was well, and bade him not to grieve, and the old man, half blind and wholly trusting, believed her, and blessed her, and died gently the winter following, never knowing he had a grandchild, and Cordelia grieved him alone, and told no one why she could not go to his deathbed as a wife should, and buried a great deal in that quiet town by the grey sea. And in the autumn of that year, in a small clean room above the school with the gulls crying outside the window, Cordelia Wren was brought to bed of a son, and named him Thomas for her father, and looked into his small crumpled face and saw, could not help but see, and turned her own face to the wall and wept at last, the exact dark grave eyes of the Duke of Inglethorpe, looking back at her out of the only thing in the world she had left him. The years that followed were the worst of the Duke of Inglethorpe's life, and the strangest thing about them was that from the outside they looked like nothing at all. He did not gamble or drink or ruin himself in the ways that grieving lords are supposed to ruin themselves. He simply went grey inside. He rose and rode and dealt with his affairs, and dined alone at the foot of the long table where she had once sat at the head, and read in the evenings the books she had left behind with her small pencil marks in the margins, and grew year by year into exactly the cold, shut-faced man the world had always taken him for. The difference was that now it was true. The grief that had once been only badly worn was worn into the bone. He was courteous to everyone and warm to no one. He put by the season entirely and never went to London. He turned 35 and 6, and the county gave up matchmaking at him and settled him among its confirmed and hopeless cases. The Duke, who had married a nobody and put her aside and would clearly never marry again, and shook its head and forgot. And all that while, at his right hand, soft and solicitous and secure, sat Aurelius Vane, for Vane had won. That was the bitter joke at the heart of it. He had won completely. The dangerous wife was gone, spirited away past all finding, past all questions. The books were safe. The slow siphoning of the estate could go on unwatched, and the Duke, sunk in his grey grief, cared less than ever for his own affairs and left them more than ever to his loyal, indispensable cousin. Vane had every reason to be content, and for a year or two he was. He grew a little richer, a little softer, a little more at his ease. He congratulated himself in the privacy of his ledger-lined room on a piece of work perfectly done. But there is a flaw in the reasoning of all such men, and it is this. They cannot conceive that anything they have buried might refuse to stay buried. They think the world is a ledger, and a thing crossed out is gone. And so Aurelius Vane made, over those secure and prosperous years, 3 small errors, each in itself nothing, which together were the seeds of his undoing. The first error was they did not destroy the tools of his forgery. Prudent man would have burned every scrap, the practice sheets on which he had drilled that false soldierly hand, the pattern letters, the very pens. But Aurelius Vane was proud of his handiwork as a craftsman is proud, and prouder still of having got clean away with it, and some small vain corner of him could not bear to burn the evidence of his own cleverness. So he kept it. He kept it in a locked japanned box in the estate office, telling himself it was safe, telling himself no one would ever look, and every year that passed made him surer that no one ever would. The second error was the maid. The maid who had been bribed to plant the letters in the Duchess's writing case, a frightened girl named Susan Coombe, had been paid and threatened and sent far off with a character Vane wrote her himself, and Vane had thought her disposed of. But frightened girls grow into troubled women, and troubled women confess, especially when they fall ill and think they are dying and cannot go into the dark with such a thing on their souls. Susan Coombe did not die that time. But she never forgot, and she carried her guilt like a stone, and she was one loose thread in Aurelius Vane's perfect work, hanging, waiting 2 counties off for a hand to pull it. The third error was the worst, and it was pure greed, having got rid of the wife who might have looked at the books. Vane grew bolder, and his thefts grew larger, and in the 5th year, needing to hide a very great sum indeed, he forged the Duke's own signature upon a bond not once, but several times, and it was this, in the end, this reached too far, that put the noose into the hands of the men who came at last to hang him. But that was still to come. For now, turn back to the Duke, 5, then 6 years into his grey life, on a raw November evening, when the first thread was pulled by a hand he did not expect. Old Penniton the butler was dying. He had served 3 dukes of Inglethorpe, and he was full of years, and he lay in his neat room over the pantry with the estate physician coming and going, and the whole house hushed, and Lucian, who had known him all his life and loved him as much as he loved anyone left in the world, sat with him through the long evenings as he had once sat with his father. And on one of those evenings, when the old man was clearer than he had been, and knew his time, Penniton took the Duke's hand in his own dry cold one and said, "Your Grace, I must tell you a thing before I go, and you must forgive an old man who kept it too long, for I had no proof, and it was not my place, and I was afraid." "Tell me," said the Duke, and thought it would be some servant's matter, some small confession of a broken vase 40 years gone. "The Duchess," said Penniton, and the Duke's whole body went still as stone. "The Duchess that was. I never believed it, Your Grace. Not one word of it, not from the first. I knew her. A whole year I watched her in this house, and I have watched people come and go for 60 years, and I know an honest heart when I have served one. She was as true as daylight, that lady, and whatever it was that turned you against her, it was a lie, and it came from, the old man's mouth worked, it came from your cousin. I cannot prove it. I have no letter, no witness, but I saw his face the day she went, Your Grace. I was carrying in the tray. I saw his face when the carriage passed the window, and it was not the face of a man who grieves. It was the face of a man who has won a wager. I have carried that these 6 years, and I could not go into the ground without laying it down. Forgive me. And then old Penniton died quietly, a little before the dawn, with the Duke of Inglethorpe sitting rigid as bedside in the grey light, and the whole slow avalanche of the truth already, though he did not yet feel it, beginning to move. He told himself it was an old man's fancy. He told himself for a week that a dying servant's love for a young mistress had painted a villain where there was none, that he had seen the proof himself, that the letters were real. But Penniton's words would not lie down. It came from your cousin. It was the face of a man who has won a wager. And now that the seed of the thought was planted, the Duke found that 100 small things he had never let himself look at came crowding up out of the dark. How it was Vane who had first hinted, Vane who had held back, Vane who had at last produced the letters, Vane who had drawn the annulment. Vane who had known always exactly which cord to pull. How it was Vane, and Vane alone, who had feared and disliked the Duchess from the first hour, though he had cloaked it in soft civility. How it was Vane who kept the books she had begun to question in the week before she was destroyed. And the Duke of Inglethorpe, who for 6 years had not once looked at his own accounts, went one cold morning into the estate office when Vane was away at the market town, and took the ledgers down and sat and read. He was no fool with figures. When he chose to attend to them, he had only never chosen. Now he chose, and it took him the better part of 2 days, going back over years, cross-checking the rents he now troubled to learn from the tenants' own mouths against the sums written down. Before the pattern rose up out of the columns like a face out of deep water, a long, patient, systematic theft, thousands upon thousands of pounds, siphoned quietly away over a decade into channels that all, when he traced them far enough, ran back to Aurelius Vane. And there, in the 5th year, plain as murder, he found his own signature on a bond he had never signed. The Duke sat a long time in the cold office with the forged bond in his hands and the whole rotten truth open before him, and the thing he felt was not, at first, rage. It was a horror so vast and so cold that it had no name. For if Vane had forged this, if Vane could sit at his right hand for a decade stealing his fortune and forging his name and smiling all the while, then Vane could forge anything. Then Vane could forge a soldier's love letter. Then the letters that had convinced him, the letters on which he had condemned and cast out and destroyed the only good thing he had ever been given, the letters he had believed because some sick part of him wanted to believe he could not be loved. Those letters were the work of the same soft hand that had written his name on this bond, and Cordelia Wren had been innocent, wholly and perfectly innocent, from the first word to the last, and he had known it, somewhere all along, and had chosen the lie because it fit the shape of his own cowardice. He put his face in his hands, the Duke of Inglethorpe, alone in the cold office where the ruin had been engineered, and for the first time in 6 years he wept, not softly, not with dignity, but as a strong man weeps who has understood at last exactly what he has thrown away, and who knows that there is no one in the world to blame for it but himself. Then he lifted his head and wiped his face, and became, in the space of one long breath, a wholly different man from the grey ghost who had drifted through 6 dead years. Because there was work to do now. There was a wrong to be set right, if it could be set right, a woman to be found, if she could be found, a truth to be dragged into the light and a devil to be dragged down, and Lucien St-Aubin, who had let his life be taken from him by lies, because he had not the courage to demand the truth, discovered that he had, after all, a great deal of courage left. And that grief turned at last to purpose is the most terrible engine in the world. He did not confront Vane. That was the first hard lesson his new purpose taught him, that a man who has been made a fool of by patience must answer with patience, or lose everything a second time. If he flung the forged bond in Vane's soft face now, Vane would smile and deny and burn every scrap of evidence before the week was out, and slip away with his stolen thousands to some continental town, and the truth about the letters would go into the fire with him. And Cordelia's name would never be cleared. No, he would build his case as carefully as Vane had built the lie, and he would spring it whole, and there would be no crack for the spider to slip through. So the Duke of Inglethorpe did a thing that cost his proud nature a great deal. He went on smiling at Aurelius Vane. He sat at meat with him and spoke of the harvest and let the man believe him still the incurious grey ghost of 6 dead years, while beneath the surface he moved with a cold ferocity that would have frightened Vane badly had he seen it. He engaged quietly. Through a London lawyer he trusted and swore to secrecy, man of business of a very particular kind, a former thief-taker turned inquiry agent, a Mr. Josie O'Rourke, a big quiet Exbow Street man with a memory like a steel trap and no scruples that got in the way of an honest fee. And to Rourke, in the locked library at midnight, the Duke gave 2 commissions. The first was to build, silently and beyond all doubt, the case against Aurelius Vane, to trace the stolen money through every channel to its end, to find the tradesmen and the bankers and the go-betweens, to secure the forged bond and any other forgery that could be found, and, this above all, to find, if he could, any proof that the love letters that had broken the marriage were forgeries too. There will be practice sheets, said the Duke, who had come to understand his cousin's vanity. He is a proud craftsman. He will not have burned them. Find them. The second commission was harder and dearer, and the Duke's voice was not quite steady when he gave it. Find her, he said, find my wife. She calls herself Wren, most like Cordelia Wren. She had a cousin, a schoolmistress, somewhere I never troubled to learn. She has been gone 6 years, and I have no thread but this, that she is good and clever and poor and proud, and that wherever she is she will be doing some quiet good and troubling no one. Find her, Rock. Do not approach her, do not frighten her, only find her and tell me where she is, and let me know that she is well. That is all I ask for now. Whether she will ever suffer me within a mile of her again is another matter, and I have no right to hope for it. But I must know that she is well. Rourke, a hard man, looked at the Duke of Inglethorpe across the candle, and something in the ruin of that proud face moved even him, and he said only, I'll find her, your grace, and took his fee, and went. It took him a bare fortnight to find her. 6 years the Duke had not found her, and Josie O'Rourke found her in 14 days, for the Duke had never truly looked, had been too proud and too ashamed and too much afraid of what he might learn, whereas Rourke simply followed the plain trail of a woman who had never really hidden, who had used her own maiden name, who had written openly to a father in a known parish, who had left, for anyone with the wit to follow, a track as clear as footprints in snow. She was in Malcolm, the seaside town 2 counties off. She taught the little ones at Mrs. Fenn's school for girls. She was thought a widow. She lived quiet and respected and poor, and she had a son. Rourke laid this lost upon the library table with the rest, in his flat report-taker's voice, watching the Duke's face as he did it, for he was a careful man and he wished to see how the news landed. A boy, your grace, near 6 years of age by the look of him. I did not enquire too close, mindful of your order not to frighten the lady, but I watched the school let out, and there is a dark boy always at her hand, and the townsfolk call him young Master Wren, and say the widow's son is the image of his father, though none of them ever saw the father, the lady being a stranger come among them. Rourke paused. I make no claim, your grace. It is not my place. I only set down what I saw. The Duke of Inglethorpe had gone very white and very still. He was doing a sum, the coldest, simplest, most shattering sum of his life. 6 years of age. She had gone in the March. The boy was near 6. He counted the months, and counted them again, and there was no other answer, there could be no other answer, and the room seemed to tilt slowly around him. For he understood that his wife had walked out of his gates 6 years ago carrying his child, his son, his heir, the future of the whole ancient line of Inglethorpe, and had said not one word, had let him believe her gone empty-handed, had raised his son in a poor seaside town under a false widowhood rather than give the boy over to a father who had believed her a wanton on a forged letter. The image of his father, the Duke said very low, and it was not a question, so they say, your grace. Lucian rose and went to the window, the same window from which he had watched her walk away, and stood with his back to Rourke a long while, and Rourke had the decency to say nothing. When the Duke turned again his face was terrible, not with rage now, but with a grief so total and a resolve so absolute that Rourke, who had faced down murderers, took an involuntary step back. You have done well, said the Duke. There is a bonus in it for you, and my thanks, which I do not give lightly. Now hear me. The matter of my cousin, you will pursue to the end and bring me every proof, and when I say the word, not before, we will spring it whole, and it must be whole, for I will not have one thread left for him to hang his innocence upon. Do you understand me? I do, your grace. As for the other matter, said the Duke, and here his voice, for all his resolve, went rough, you will do nothing. You will not go near her, nor the boy, nor the town. That is mine to do, and I will do it myself, on my own feet, and I will do it. He drew a long breath. I will do it as a man who has no right on earth to be forgiven, going to ask forgiveness of the only person who could ever grant it. Leave me the direction of the school, then leave me be. He did not go at once. That was the measure of how much he had changed, and how much he had learned. That though every hour of the 6 wasted years screamed at him to order the carriage and drive through the night and fall at her feet by morning, he did not. For he understood, now, what he had not understood at 33, that this was not about his own longing, his own guilt, his own desperate need to make it right. It was about her. It was about a woman he had wronged past all measure, who had built, out of the wreck he made, a quiet, decent life for herself and her son, and who did not owe him so much as the opening of a door. To descend on her with his rank and his carriage and his anguish, to overturn her hard-won peace for the ease of his own conscience, that would be one more selfishness, one more taking, in a life that had already taken everything from her. If he went to her, he must go humbly and slowly, and prepared to be refused, and prepared above all to think first, at every step, of what was best for her and for the boy, and not for himself. So he made ready with care. He set his affairs in order against the day the trap on Vane would close. He wrote and burned and wrote again, a dozen times, a letter to Cordelia, a short plain letter that made no defense and offered no excuse, that said only that he had learned the truth of the great wrong done to her, that he knew now she had been wholly innocent and he wholly, unforgivably deceived, that he asked nothing and expected nothing, but that he begged the favour, if she could bear it, of leave to call upon her once, at any hour she named, to say to her face what he could not trust to paper, and that whether she granted it or refused it, she and hers should want for nothing so long as he lived, and he would trouble her no further than she wished. He did not sign it Inglethorpe. He signed it, after long thought, only Lucian, because the man who had wronged her was Lucian, not the Duke, and it was as a man and not a duke that he must come, if she would have him come at all. He sent the letter by Rock's own hand, sealed, with instruction to give it to her privately and wait one day for an answer and press her in no way whatsoever. And then the Duke of Inglethorpe, who had faced the death of his father and the loss of his wife and the ruin of his faith, faced the hardest thing he had ever faced, which was to wait quietly, in the great empty house, upon the judgment of a woman he had every reason to believe would never forgive him, and to know that whatever she decided would be just. The answer, when it came, was very short. It was in her small firm hand, the hand he would have known among 10,000, on a plain half-sheet of school paper, and it said only this: "You may come on Sunday, after the morning service, at the school. I make no promises. There is a person I must think of before myself, and it is of him I will be thinking, not of you. See it of you." The Duke read it standing, and read it again sitting, and a third time by the fire, and he understood that she had told him, in that one small, merciless, honest line, that she knew he had learned of the boy, and that the boy, his son, whom he had never seen, was the gate he must pass, and the judge he must satisfy, and the whole of what mattered now, and that if he came to her thinking of his own redemption he would fail, and rightly, but that if he came thinking, as she thought, of the child before himself, then there might, only might, be a door not quite closed. And Lucian sobbed and folded the half-sheet and put it against his heart, where for 11 months long ago a living warmth had been, and made ready to go and be judged. Malcombe was a small grey town that tumbled down a hill to a small grey sea, and the school stood near the top of it. A plain stone house with a walled garden and a green door, and it was to the green door that the Duke of Inglethorpe came on foot, on a bright cold Sunday in the early spring, 6 years and a little after the grey Tuesday he had never ceased to see. He had left the carriage at the inn below and walked up, because he wished to come to her as a man walks, and he had dressed plainly, in a dark coat with no more of the Duke about him than he could help. And he stood a moment before the green door with his hat in his hand and his heart going like a boy's, and then he knocked. She opened it herself. 6 years had touched her. He saw it in one blow, and it went through him like cold iron, a fineness about the temples, a settledness in the grey eyes, the marks of hard work and hard winters and grief borne alone. She was no longer the girl who had told him he might stand in the rain on his dignity. She was a woman who had crossed a great deal of dark country on her own 2 feet. and she was to him more beautiful than she had ever been, and he had never in his life so wished to say a thing and so wholly lacked the right to say it. She looked at him a long moment on the doorstep, quite composed, and then she stood aside and said only, "Come in. He is at his lessons with Mrs. Fenn. We have a little while." And she led him into a small plain parlour with a sea light in the window and a fire barely lit against the cost of coal, and she did not offer him her hand, and she did not sit, and neither did he. "Cordelia," he said, and then found that all the letters he had written and burned were gone out of his head, every careful word of them, and there was nothing left but the plain thing. "I have no right to be here. I know it. I will say what I came to say, and then I will go if you tell me to go, and I will not come again unless you send for me, and you need never fear that I will use anything against you. I came only to tell you that I know it was all a lie. The letters were forged. My cousin forged them, and I have the proof of it, or will have. And you were innocent, wholly, from the first, and I knew you were good. I always knew it. And I let a coward's fear in my own heart make me believe a devil's lie, because it was easier to think myself unworthy of you than to trust that I was loved. I destroyed the best thing that was ever given to me, and I did it with my own hand, and there is no forgiveness I have any right to ask. I know that. I am not here to ask it." He stopped. His voice had gone rough. "I am here to say that I am sorry, which is a small enough word for so great a wrong, and to say it to your face, because you deserved at least that 6 years ago, and I did not give it to you, and I've hated myself every day since." She had listened without a word, her hands folded, her face very still, and when he finished she was quiet a long moment, looking not at him but at the small grey sea in the window. Then she said, in a low even voice, "Do you know, in 6 years I imagined you saying almost those exact words. I imagined it 1,000 times at first, lying awake, and in my imagining when you said them I do not know what I thought I would feel, triumph perhaps, or the old love come back, and now you have said them truly, and I find I feel neither. I feel only very tired and very sorry for you, Lucian, which I did not expect, and which I do not think you will thank me for." "I will thank you for anything you are willing to give me," he said, "including your pity, though I know how little a proud man ought to want it." "It is not pity exactly." She turned from the window. "It is this. I have had 6 years to learn a hard truth, and it is that what happened to us was not chiefly your cousin's doing, wicked as he was. Your cousin lit the match, but the house was already built of tinder, and you built it. You married me not believing you deserved me, and a man who does not believe he deserves a thing is always waiting for it to be taken away, and will half help the thief who comes to take it. I saw it in your face the day you showed me the letters. You were not surprised. You were confirmed. Some part of you was almost relieved to have the other shoe fall at last." Her voice did not accuse. It was worse than accusing, it was simply true. "That is the thing I could not forgive, and it is the thing your apology does not touch, because you cannot apologize for the shape of a soul. I do not know if that shape has changed. I have no way to know, and I have a son to think of, and I will not gamble his heart on the hope that a proud broken man has learned to believe he is worth loving, when he could not learn it for me." The Duke of Inglethorpe stood very still and took it all of it, for it was just, and he had promised himself he would take whatever was just, and then, because he had also promised himself he would tell her the whole truth however it cost him, he said, "You are right. Every word of it is right. I did not believe I deserved you, and I do not believe it now, but I have learned one thing in 6 years of the emptiest life a man ever lived, and it is this, that whether or not I deserved you has nothing to do with anything, because love is not a wage that is earned. You told me that once at the stile. You said you'd love me, which I had not asked for but should have anyway. I did not understand it then. I thought love must be deserved, and so I could never rest in it, and so I threw it away. I understand it now when it is too late to do me any good. And I would rather spend the rest of my life having learned it too late than never have learned it at all." He drew a breath. "I am not here to win you back. I have no such hope and no such right. I am here because you should not have carried it all alone. And because there is a person in this house whom I have wronged as much as I wronged you, in never being there, and I would like, if you will ever permit it, not soon, only some day, if ever, to try in whatever small way you allow, to be of some use to him. That is all. His good, not mine. You said it in your letter and you were right. It is of him I should be thinking, and I am. And it was at that exact moment, as though the small house had been listening, that the parlor door opened, and a dark-haired boy of near 6 came in with a slate under his arm and a question already on his lips, and stopped short at the sight of the tall stranger, and looked up. And the Duke of Inglethorpe looked down into his own eyes. There was no possible doubt. Rourke had said the image of his father, and Rourke had understated. It was the St. Aubin face in little, the same grave dark eyes, the same set of the brow. The very look Lucien had seen in his own boyhood portrait that hung in the long gallery at Inglethorpe. And the boy looked up at him with a child's frank curiosity, unafraid, and said, "Are you a friend of my mother's?" Lucien could not speak. He who had faced everything could not speak. He went down on one knee, slowly there on the worn parlor rug, so that his face was level with the boy's, and he looked at his son for the first time in his life, and he found that his eyes had filled, and he did not care. "Yes," he said when he could. "Yes. I am a very old friend of your mother's. My name is Lucien, and you must be Thomas." "How did you know?" said the boy, pleased and suspicious at once in the way of children. "Your mother named you for a good man," said the Duke, "and I can see she chose well." And he put out his hand gravely as to a small gentleman, and the boy after a moment's consideration shook it, his small warm fingers closing over the Duke's, and Lucien St. Aubin held his son's hand for the first time and thought his heart would break in two with the joy and the grief of it together. He looked up. Cordelia stood by the window with her hand pressed to her mouth, and her eyes were bright, and for the first time the composure had gone out of her face, and something raw and unguarded had come into it. Not forgiveness, not yet, nothing so simple, but the naked sight of a father meeting his son, which no woman who had loved that father could watch unmoved. Their eyes met over the boy's dark head, and neither of them could say a word, and none was needed, for a whole world passed between them in that look, the ruin, and the years, and the child got in love and raised in secret, and the long road each had walked alone, and the terrible, fragile, impossible question of whether anything could yet be built again out of so much wreckage. "Thomas," said Cordelia at last in a voice not quite her own, "go and tell Mrs. Fenn that our guest will stay to dinner. Run along." And the boy went, all unknowing, clattering his slate, and left the two of them alone in the small room with the sea light on the walls and 6 years of silence finally, unbearably, broken. "You should not have knelt to him," she said low. "You will teach him to expect it. He is a schoolmistress' son. He must not learn grand ways." "He is my son," said the Duke, still on his knee, looking up at her, "and I will kneel to him every day of my life if you let me near him, and to you also, Cordelia, for I have knelt to no one in my pride these 6 years, and I find I have been standing far too long." And Cordelia Wren, who had signed the annulment without a word and walked away without a word and carried his secret through 6 hard years without a word, put her face in her 2 hands at last and wept and did not send him away. All of that lay ahead, in the warm certain country of the ending. But the Duke of Inglethorpe learned in the slow patient months of that first year in Malcolm the shape of the 6 years he had not been there to share, pieced them together out of Mrs. Fenn's dry asides and the boy's careless chatter, and at long last, out of Cordelia's own quiet telling on an evening by the fire, and every piece of it went into him like a nail, and he was glad of the pain, for he thought a man ought to know exactly what he had cost the woman he loved. And this was the shape of it as he came to know it, and between the grey Tuesday and the sea light there were 6 years, and those 6 years must be told, for it is in them that the whole worth of this history lies. It is easy to love a happy woman. It is the long dark middle, the years no one sees, that make or break a soul, and Cordelia Wren's long dark middle was made of small hard days strung one after another like beads on a plain grey thread, and she wore them, and did not break. And the Duke of Inglethorpe, when at last he came to understand what those years had held, understood too that he had not the smallest right to her, and would spend his life not deserving her, and was at peace with that, as a man is at peace with the height of a mountain he loves. She had come to Malcolm with a small trunk and a great secret and £40 sewn into the hem of her cloak, which was all the money in the world she had, for she had taken from the Duke's settlement not 1 shilling. She had signed the annulment and refused the gold that went with it, sending back, in a plain sealed packet from a coaching inn along the road, the bank draft his lawyers had pressed on her, with a single line in her small, firm hand: "I will not be paid for my dishonour, having committed none." The Duke never saw that line. Vane intercepted the packet and pocketed the draft, and told the Duke the settlement had been drawn and delivered and accepted, one more theft among the 100, and so the Duke lived 6 years believing at least that she wanted for nothing, when in truth she had gone out into the world with £40 and a child on the way and nothing else but her own 2 hands and her own straight back. Mrs. Fenn had taken her in without a question, which is the rarest kindness in the world and the one Cordelia never forgot. Mrs. Fenn was her mother's cousin, a widow of near 60 who had buried a husband and 2 children and a good deal of hope, and who kept her small school for the daughters of tradesmen and half-pay officers on a shoestring and a prayer. And when a pale, composed young woman had appeared at her door with a trunk and a story that did not quite add up, and a secret plainly written under her cloak, Mrs. Fenn had looked at her once, hard out of shrewd, kind old eyes, and had said only, "You'll want tea, and then you'll want a bed. And the rest will keep. There's a room over the schoolroom that's yours as long as you like, and there's work if you want it, for I'm getting old and the little ones tire me. And I'll ask you no questions, child, for I can see you've had a bellyful of being asked, and whatever it is, it's plain to me you did nothing to be ashamed of, and that's an end of it in this house." And it was an end of it. Cordelia never told her the whole truth, and Mrs. Fenn never asked. And the 2 of them ran the little school together for 6 years in a companionship that was worth more to Cordelia in her dark middle than gold or comfort or anything the Duke could ever have given her, for it was freely given and asked nothing back. And it was the first thing since the grey Tuesday that taught her the world was not, after all, made only of Aurelius veins. The boy was born in the autumn, as has been told, in the small, clean room over the schoolroom with the gulls crying, and Cordelia named him Thomas for her father, and looked into his face and saw the Duke, and wept ward into the pillow, and then never again over that particular grief, for she had a living child now, and no time for weeping and no wish to teach him sorrow with her milk. She raised him plain and honest and merry. She never spoke to him one bitter word of his father. She never spoke to him of his father at all, if she could help it, and when the boy grew old enough to ask, as children mercilessly, where his papa was, she told him only that his papa was far away, and that was a sad story and one for when he was bigger, and she said it so quietly and so finely that the boy, who loved her, learned not to press, and made up for himself as children will, a papa who was a sea captain lost on a voyage, which the town half believed and which did no harm, and Cordelia let it stand, for it was kinder than the truth, and she had resolved of all things that her son should never learn to be ashamed of where he came from, nor grow up with the weight of a great wrong on his small shoulders. He should be light, she would carry the weight. That was a mother's whole business, as she understood it, to carry the weight so that the child might run, and run he did. He was by every account the happiest child in Malcolm. He was dark and grave in repose, with his father's brow and his father's deep considering eyes, but he laughed easily and often, and he was mad for horses from the time he could walk, standing at the top of the town by the carrier's yard for whole afternoons to watch the great patient dray horses come and go, and Cordelia, who could not afford a pony and could not afford much of anything, saved and scrimped, and once, on his 5th birthday, paid the carrier 6pence, a whole 6pence, a fortune out of a schoolmistress's wage, to let the boy sit up on the broad warm back of a dray horse and be led once at a walk up and down the yard, and the look on his face was worth, she thought, every hard penny of it. She told no one that she went without her own dinner 3 days to make up that 6pence. There was a great deal she told no one. That was the shape of those years, a woman doing without, quietly, so that a child need never know there was doing without to be done. She was respected in the town, and liked, and pitied a little, for a young widow with a child and no means is a figure that draws pity, and she bore the pity as she bore everything, with a level chin and a private reservation. She taught the little ones their letters and their figures and their globes, and she taught them, without ever seeming to teach it, a kind of straight plain honesty that the mothers of Malcolm remarked on and valued. So that in time it became a thing to say of a well-brought-up child that she had been to Mrs. Wren at the school. She read to the sick, as she had read in her father's parish. She sat with the dying. She was, in that grey seaside town, exactly the quiet good presence she had been at Inglethorpe and in the vicarage before it. For goodness is not a thing that depends on circumstance, and a soul that is good in a duchess's silk is good also in a schoolmistress's stuff gown, and Cordelia Wren was good all the way through. In Malcombe as everywhere, and the town was the better for her though it never knew the half of what it had. Only twice in 6 years did the old wound break open, and both times she shut it again with her own hands and told no one. The first was when word came by a roundabout country way that her father was dead, the mild, half-blind, scholarly clergyman who had fed a wet stranger and blessed a duke and never known he had a grandson. He had died believing his daughter and the duke had merely found they did not suit, had died. That is, in a small kind lie she had told him to spare him grief, and she could not go to his deathbed, for she could not appear in that parish as a cast-off wife with a child, and she could not tell the truth, and so she stayed in Malcombe and grieved him alone, in her room over the schoolroom, with her fist pressed to her mouth so the boy should not hear, and buried her father in her heart with no stone and no funeral and no one beside her, and rose the next morning and taught the little ones their letters with dry eyes and a steady voice. And no one in the school knew that Mrs. Wren had lost the last of her own people in the night. That was the loneliest hour of the 6 years. She never spoke of it. She only that Sunday kept the boy Thomas by her a little longer than usual and held his hand a little tighter, walking home from church past the small grey sea, because he was now, quite literally, all she had in the world. The second time the wound broke was smaller and stranger, and she never understood it fully herself. It was in the 4th year, on a market day, when a grand travelling carriage with a crest on the door, not the Inglethorpe crest she saw at once, some other great families, only passing through, rattled up the main street of Malcombe on its way to somewhere finer, and the boy Thomas, then 4, stood in the road and stared at it with his whole soul in his face, at the matched greys and the liveried men, and the glittering wheels, and said, "Mamma, is that a duke?" And Cordelia, taken utterly unawares, felt the ground tilt under her, for it was the first time the child had ever spoken the word, plucked out of the air of a market day, and she looked down at her son gazing after the grand carriage with naked longing, all unknowing that he was himself the son of a duke and heir to a house 10 times as fine as the one rolling past, and something in her cracked clean across. She took him home and gave him his tea and put him to bed, and then she sat a long time in the dark by the cold hearth, wondering for the only time in all those years whether she had done right, whether she had any business, out of her own pride and her own wound, to keep from this child his birthright, his name, his father, the wide lawns and the ponies, and the whole bright world that was his by blood, whether her silence, which she had chosen to protect him, was not in truth robbing him. And she sat with that question half the night, and it had no easy answer, and in the end she came back to the same hard place she always came back to, that his father believed his mother a wanton, and would believe the child no true St. Aubin, or would take the boy and cast off the mother, and that either way lay grief, and that a name and a pony were not worth setting a child down in the middle of that. So she kept her silence again, but she never forgot on his face at the grand carriage, and she carried the doubt of it quietly, all the rest of the 6 years, one more weight among the many. And so the years went by the grey sea, small and hard and unremarked, and the woman did not break. And the boy grew straight and merry, and 2 counties off in a great house a man was going grey inside with a grief he had brought upon himself, and neither of them knew the other lived and grieved so near, and the whole tangled skein waited year upon year for a dying butler's hand to find the loose thread and pull. The month the Duke had been granted stretched, by Cordelia's grace, into a season, and the season into the slow rebuilding of a life, and if the 6 lost years had been the dark middle of her story, that patient spring and summer were the tenderest chapter of his, and he knew it, and hoarded every hour of it. and would not for the world have hurried a single day. He came to mile combat first, once a month, and then, as the green door opened wider, once a fortnight, always by the same road, always on foot up the grey hill from the inn where he left the carriage that would have shamed the modest street. He never came grand. He learned to leave the Duke at the bottom of the hill with the horses and to walk up as plain Mr. Steorban, the old friend of the family, in a dark coat no finer than a country attorney's, and it eased him more than he could say to be, for a few hours, only a man among people who did not bow. He brought no costly gifts. He had understood, and had cost his pride a pang to understand it, that to shower the poor school with a duke's largesse would be to humiliate the very independence Cordelia had bled to keep. So he brought small things, careful things, a book of horses for the boy, with pictures, a paper of good tea for Mrs. Fenn, who was a tyrant about her tea, once, greatly daring a length of plain warm wool for a winter cloak, offered so awkwardly and so humbly that Cordelia, who had meant to refuse all gifts on principle, had not the heart, and took it, and made the cloak and wore it, and he saw her wear it once by the sea and had to turn his face away. The boy was the bridge, as she had known he would be, and as the Duke came slowly to bless. Thomas took to his mother's grave old friend with the whole open ready trust of a child who has no father and a great hunger, unspoken for one, and the Duke, who had never in his life been easy with children, found that with this one child he was easy as breathing, for it was his own. And the blood knew the blood though the boy did not. They talked of horses by the hour, the Duke, kneeling in the sand of the little beach below the town while the grey waves came in, taught the boy to draw a horse in the wet sand with a stick, the line of the neck, the set of the legs. And the boy drew and shouted with laughter when a wave washed his horses away and made them draw them all again, and Cordelia sat above them on the sea wall in her plain cloak and watched the tall grave man and the small dark boy bent together over the sand, and the Duke, glancing up, saw her watching and saw in her face a thing so tender and so guarded and so unbearably sad all at once that he had to look back down at the sand very quickly and steady his own breathing before the boy should see. He did not court her. He was scrupulous about that, almost to a fault. He never once, that whole spring, spoke to Cordelia of love, nor of the past, nor of any hope for the future. He had resolved that he would not press her, would not so much as let her feel the weight of his wanting, until and unless she opened that door herself. He came for the boy, he told himself and told her, and it was even half true. But the other half of the truth was that he was courting her all the same, in the only honest way left to a man who has forfeited every right, by being, patiently week after week, quietly present, quietly good. Quietly there, asking nothing, by letting her see, over 100 small unhurried hours, that the man she had married and the man she had wrongly thought him and the man who had wronged her were all three gone, and that what stood in their place was someone new, made by grief and made by shame into something she had never met before, whom she might, if she chose, in her own time, come slowly to trust. It was the hardest wooing in the world, being no wooing at all, and it was the only one that could have won her, and some deep-schooled patience in him, learned in 6 years of loving an empty house, knew it and held to it, and did not falter. The truth-telling came in the autumn, on a wild wet evening when the sea was loud against the town and the boy was long abed, and Mrs. Fenn, with the tact of an old woman who sees a great deal and says little, had taken herself off early with a candle and a significant good night. The Duke had meant to go back down to the inn. The storm kept him, and so they sat, the two of them, on either side of the small fire in the plain parlour, and for a long while neither spoke, and the rain ran down the black windows, and then Cordelia, looking into the fire and not at him, began quietly to tell him the 6 years. She told it plainly, without pity for herself and without reproach for him, in the same level voice with which she had once told him he might stand in the rain on his dignity, the £40 in the hem, and the packet with the return draft, and Mrs. Fenn's kindness, and the room over the schoolroom, and the boy born with the gulls crying, her father's death and the deathbed she could not go to, the 6 for the dray horse and the 3 dinners it cost, the grand carriage on market day and the boy's face and the long night of doubt after. And the Duke of Inglethorpe sat and listened to the plain, unadorned account of exactly what his cowardice had cost, every nail of it going into him. And he did not once try to soften it, or excuse himself or turn her pity toward him, but only listened, with his head bowed and his hands gripped white between his knees, and took it, all of it, as his due. When she had done, the fire had burned low, and the rain had eased, and there was a long silence, and then the Duke said very low, without lifting his head, "I sent the settlement believing it would keep you. When I learned, this year, that Vane had stolen even that you went out with £40 and my son unborn while I sat in that house believing you comfortable, I think that was the hour I hated myself most of all the 6 years' worth of hours. Not because I might have made you rich. You would not have taken my riches and you were right not to, but because I did not even earn the small mercy of knowing you were fed. I failed you even at that, even at the least of it. You did not know," she said. "I did not trouble to know," he answered. "That is the whole of my sin," Cordelia said in 4 words. "I did not trouble to know. I did not trouble to know my own estate, and a thief bled it for a decade. I did not trouble to know my own wife, and a lie broke us in a week. I did not trouble to know my own heart, and so I could not tell love from fear when they stood before me. A man who will not trouble to know is at the mercy of every liar in the world, and deserves to be, and I was, and I have paid, and you have paid far more. And the boy asleep upstairs paid most of all, having no father, for my sloth. He lifted his head at last, and his eyes were wet, and he did not hide it. I have troubled to know since, it is the one poor amends I can make. There is nothing now in my life, nor in my estate, nor in my own soul, that I do not look at squarely, however it shames me. It is late learned, and it was dearly bought, and it is the only thing of any worth I have to lay at your feet, a man who has finally, at cost, learned to look." And Cordelia looked at him a long moment across the dying fire, and something in her face changed. Some last frozen thing that had held since the grey Tuesday quietly gave way, and she said softly, "That is worth more than you know. It is worth, perhaps, more than all the rest." And she'd not say she forgave him, not that night. But she rose, and she put another small piece of coal on the fire against the cold, an extravagance, a whole extra coal, and he understood the language of it. Understood that she was telling him without words that he might stay a little longer, and she sat down again, and they talked, quietly, of small things, of the boy and the horses and the storm, until the rain stopped and the tide turned. And it was the first easy hour that had passed between them in 7 years, and both of them knew it, and neither of them named it, for fear of frightening it away. It was into the middle of that slow mending, the deepest cut of the whole history, the one that might have wrecked it all a second time, that the reckoning fell. For the news of Aurelius Vane's arrest could not be kept from Malcolm, and the Duke was resolved she should hear the whole of it from him, and not from a broadside or a gossiping mouth. He came down the very hour the trap was sprung, ahead of the news, grey with the strain of it, and told her all, the maid's confession, the practice sheets, the forged bond, the coming trial, and watched the 6-year-old wound laid open before her one last time. The whole cruel machinery of her ruin displayed. She bore it as she bore all things, white and steady. But when he told her that Susan Combe had wept with relief to confess, and had carried the guilt 6 years like a stone, Cordelia was quiet a long while. And then she said a thing that the Duke never forgot, and that told him, more than any word of forgiveness could have, what manner of woman he had wronged. The maid, Susan. She was frightened, and poor and Vane threatened her. I remember her, a little thing with red hands, always afraid. I do not want her hanged, Lucian, nor gaoled, nor broken. She has punished herself 6 years already, which is longer than any judge would give her. Let her swear her oath and clear my name, and then let her go home to her husband, and see that she wants for nothing. Vane made a weapon of her fear. I will not let the law make a second weapon of her honesty. And the Duke, who had come braced for her righteous anger and found instead her mercy, bowed his head, and saw to it exactly as she asked. And Susan Combe went home unpunished and provided for, and blessed the young Duchess's name to the end of her days. And the Duke understood that the woman he loved was better than justice, which is a rare and awful thing to understand about another human soul, and it humbled him more than all his own shame had done. So the great wrong was undone, and the schemer carried off in chains to the world's far side, and the name of Cordelia ran cleared before all 3 counties. And through it all the Duke of Inglethorpe stood not in triumph, but in a kind of trembling gratitude. watching the wreck he had made be slowly, mercifully, undeservedly repaired around him by hands stronger and kinder than his own, the maid's late honesty, the old butler's dying love, the schoolmistress's unquestioning welcome, and above all the steady, incorruptible goodness of the woman herself, who had been given every reason in the world to grow bitter and had, instead, only grown deep. He had gone to Malcolm to make what amends a wrecked man. He found to his lasting wonder that the amends were being made to him, that he was being, slowly and against all his deserving, forgiven, and he took it as a beggar takes bread, with both hands and a full heart, and never once mistook it for anything he had earned. He did not press her. He had learned at last the whole hard art of not pressing. He stayed to dinner that Sunday, a plain school dinner of mutton greens, at which the boy Thomas talked without stopping, and the Duke of Inglethorpe, who had dined in silence at the foot of a long table for 6 years, laughed twice aloud, and was astonished at the sound, and then he took his leave with a bow, and went back down the grey hill to the inn, and did not ask when he might come again. But before he went, at the green door Cordelia said, quietly, not looking at him, "You may write to him, short letters, about your horses. He is mad for horses. And you may come again in a month if you still wish it, and we will see. I promise nothing. But he liked you, and he has no father, and I will not make him pay for what lies between you and me. That would be to punish the wrong person, and I have had 6 years of watching what it does to a person to be punished for a thing that was not their fault." "A month," said the Duke, as though she had granted him a kingdom which she had. "Thank you. I will not fail him. I will not fail either of you. Not this time," and he kept his word. He wrote to the boy short letters about the horses, about the great cedar on the south lawn, and the pony that might, some day, if a certain young gentleman wished it, come to live in Malcolm, but letters a child could read aloud, which Thomas did at the school proudly to Mrs. Fenn. And he came again in a month, and again, and through that slow spring and summer the Duke of Inglethorpe courted, with a patience and a humility that would have astonished the county, not a woman but a family, coming as a friend, asking nothing, earning by inches the trust of a proud, tired woman and the love of a small, dark boy, and rebuilding, plank by careful plank, over the drowned wreck of what he had destroyed, something new and truer, and founded this time not on his own hunger to be loved, but on the plain daily work of loving. But there was still the reckoning to come, and it came that autumn, and it came hard, for Josie O'Rourke had done his work, and done it whole, through the long spring and summer, while the Duke went quietly back and forth to Malcombe. Rache had traced the last of Aurelius Vane's stolen thousands to their hidden ends, had secured sworn statements from the bankers and the go-betweens, had laid hands upon the forged bond and 2 others besides, and, crowning all, had done the one thing the Duke had most desired and least dared to hope. He had found the maid. Susan Combe was living, married now and much aged by her secret, in a manufacturing town in the north, and when Rache came to her door and spoke, gently, the name of Inglethorpe, she had gone white and then, to his surprise, had wept with something almost like relief, for she had carried her guilt 6 years, and had rotted the peace out of her, and she was glad past speaking, to set it down at last. She told everything. How Vane had bribed her and threatened her, and made her slip the forged letters into the young Duchess's writing case. How she had known the lady was innocent and had done it anyway, for fear and for money, and had hated herself ever since. She would swear to it, she said. She would swear to it before any judge in England, and take whatever punishment was hers. Only let it be told, let the good lady's name be cleared, for she had prayed 6 years for a way to make it right, and in the estate office at Inglethorpe, in the locked japanned box that his vanity would not let him burn, were found, when at last the trap was sprung, the practice sheets, page upon page of that false soldierly hand, drilled and perfected, the very phrases of the forged love letters copied over and over in Aurelius Vane's own writing. It was, as the lawyers said afterward, as complete a case of forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy as had ever come before the assizes. The Duke sprang it whole, as he had promised, on a grey October morning, with no warning at all. Vane came into the breakfast-room at Inglethorpe as he had come every morning for a decade, soft and smiling and secure, and found the Duke of Inglethorpe waiting for him at the head of the table, with the forged bond laid out upon the cloth, and beside the Duke a magistrate, and behind the magistrate 2 constables, and by the window the big quiet shape of Josiah Rourke, and Vane understood in one instant that the ice he had walked upon so long had finally, silently, given way beneath him. He tried, of course. Men like Vane always try. He smiled and spread his soft hands, and spoke of misunderstandings, of jealous servants, of the Duke's grief unhinging his judgment. But the Duke of Inglethorpe did not rage at him, which frightened Vane more than any rage could have. The Duke only looked him, coldly, steadily, with the eyes of a man wholly awake at last, and laid down, one after another, upon the white cloth, the proofs, the bond, and the banker's statements, and the practice sheets from the japanned box, and last of all a copy of the sworn deposition of Susan Combe. And when Vane's eyes fell upon that last paper, and his soft face at last cracked and crumbled, and showed for one naked instant the trapped and frightened thing that had lived all along beneath the smiling mask, the Duke said, very quietly, in a voice that carried in the silent room, "You took my fortune, cousin, and I could have forgiven that. It is only money, and I have too much. But took my wife and my son and 6 years of all our lives on a forgery, and you made me the instrument of it. And you sat at my right hand and ate my bread and watched me grieve, and smiled. That I do not forgive, that the law will not forgive. Take him." They took him. Aurelius Vane was tried at the Winter Assizes, and Susan Combe swore her oath, and the practice sheets were laid before the court, and there was no defence in the world that could stand against them. And he was convicted of forgery and embezzlement, which in that hard age might have cost him his life, though the Duke, who had discovered, somewhere in his long ordeal, that he no longer had any appetite for another man's death, quietly interceded that the sentence be transportation rather than the rope. So Aurelius Vane was carried off in chains to the far side of the world, stripped of everything he had schemed a lifetime to gather, to end his days in exile and hard labour under a foreign sun, and the county, which had once shaken its head over the Duke's cast-off wife, now shook it over the master thief who had wrought the whole wickedness, and the truth ran through 3 counties like fire through stubble, that the young Duchess of Inglethorpe had been innocent all along, cruelly wronged, cast out on a lie, and that she was found again, living quiet and poor by the sea, and that there was, could it be true, a child. But by the time the county was busy with the tale, the Duke of Inglethorpe had ceased to care one straw what the county said. He was in Malcombe. He had gone down the moment the trap was sprung, before the news could reach her by any other mouth, and he had told Cordelia everything, the deposition of the maid, the practice sheets, the confession, the whole complete and public vindication of her name. And he had laid it before her not in triumph, but almost in grief, saying, "It is done. You are cleared, wholly and before all the world, and every soul in 3 counties knows now that you were wronged and I was a fool, and it changes nothing between us that you do not wish changed. I did not clear your name to buy your heart. I cleared it because it was owed to you 6 years overdue, and because our son shall grow up knowing his mother was the most honourable woman in England, which is no more than the truth." And Cordelia had read the papers through in silence. The whole cruel machinery of the lie that had cost her everything laid bare at last, and when she came to the practice sheets, the endearments she had been accused of receiving, copied over and over in Vane's cramped hand, she had gone very white, and then slowly, something that had been clenched in her for 6 years had loosened and let go. For it is one thing to know oneself innocent, and another, and a far greater thing, to see one's innocence proved beyond all doubt to the whole world, and to the one man whose belief had mattered most. She looked up at him at last, the Duke of Inglethorpe standing humbly in her poor parlour with his hat in his hands, and she said in a low unsteady voice, "You did not come to me first with this to win me. You came to me first so that I should not hear it cruelly from a stranger's mouth. You thought of my hurt before your own hope. A breath. That is not the man who showed me the letters 6 years ago. That man thought only of himself. I am not that man," said the Duke. "That man's whole world was taken from him, and he deserved to lose it, and out of the wreck of him something better was made, by you, Cordelia, though you never knew it. Every hour of these 6 years that I spent hating myself, I spent learning to be the man who might, one distant day, be worthy to stand in a room with you again. I do not say I am worthy now. I only say I am no longer the man who wronged you, and I love you. I loved you at the stile, and I loved you the day I destroyed you, and I have loved you every day of 6 empty years, and I will love you every day I have left, whether you send me away or keep me by, and none of it is a thing I earned or deserve, and all of it is simply true." And Cordelia Wren, who had signed the annulment without a word, and walked away without a word, and carried his secret and raised his son and cleared his name from her own life for 6 long silent years, looked at the Duke of Inglethorpe across the small warm room and did not send him away. They were married again, quietly, in the small church at Malcolm, where he had first come courting a family in the plain dark coat, with Mrs. Fenn weeping into her handkerchief and the boy Thomas standing up very straight in a new coat as his father's man, holding the ring on a cushion with a gravity that broke and mended every heart in the little church at once. There was no glittering county crowd this time, no cold appraising eyes. There was only the sea light through the plain windows, and a handful of people who loved them. And a woman in a grey gown. She would wear the grey, she said. It was the gown she had worn to him first, and it should be the gown she wore to him last, walking up the short aisle on no one's arm but her own, as she had walked out of his gate 6 years before, straight-backed and level-chinned. Only now she was walking toward him and not away, and afterward there was Inglethorpe, and the great cedar on the south lawn, and long evenings by the fire where a woman read aloud, and a man listened, truly listened now, to every word, and a dark grave boy who learned to ride his pony on the wide lawns, and to run shouting down the avenue of limes where his mother had once walked away in silence, and in the fullness of time other children, and much laughter in rooms that had stood empty and cold for years. And the whole great house woke up and warmed at last around the family that Aurelius Vane had schemed a lifetime to keep out of it. The Duke of Inglethorpe grew old there, in the end, with the wife he had lost and found and been given twice over, and he counted himself to his last day. Not a man who had triumphed, but a man who had been forgiven, which he knew to be the greater and the rarer thing. And he never once, in all the long good years, forgot the grey Tuesday and the pen like a fallen sword and the door clicking shut, kept it, rather, close and clear all his life. As a man keeps the memory of the cliff he nearly went over, so that he might be daily, hourly, wholly grateful for the hand that had, against all his deserving, reached down and drawn him back, for he had learned the hard and only way it can be learned, that love is not a wage to be earned nor a prize to be deserved, that it is given freely or it is nothing, and that a woman had once told him so at a stile in the red evening light, and he had not believed her, and it had cost them both 6 years and very nearly cost them everything, and that she had loved him anyway, through all of it, which he had not asked for, and did not deserve, and had, in the end, by the sheer unearned grace of it, been given all the same.